Okay, can you all see that? Okay, great. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining today's presentation. My name is Corey Kamholtz. I'm a design principal with FGM Architects, and I focus on higher education design. I'm one of the co-chairs for AIA Chicago's Education Knowledge Community. My co-chair here is Kaisa Heinitz. Kaisa, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Kaisa Heinitz, and I'm a senior project architect at SMNGA Architects in Chicago, and we focus on preschool through K through 8 is our typical age, and we're excited to have you all here today.
Before we get started in earnest, just a couple of things that I wanted to go over. One is first to thank our sponsors. Allegiant and Smith Group are our annual friend level sponsors. So their support makes programming and events like this possible. We also want to take a moment to thank some of the firms and companies that are in AIA Chicago's highest level of sponsorship, and that's the 1869 Circle. I'm just going to quickly list them off here. We have Arup Black Spectacles, Eggersman, Gensler, Ice Miller, Jan, Lamar Johnson, Lurch Bates, Lightning Protection Institute, Miller Knoll, Norcon, PacClad, Perkins and Will, Ratio, Schuler Shook, Sierra Pacific Windows, SOM, Smith Group, and Stantec. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second and we'll introduce our panelists. So first, I'd like to have Dr. Sally Augustine introduce herself.
Sure. I'm Sally Augustine. I'm an applied environmental psychologist. We're the people in the scientific world who think about things such as how the colors you see, scents you smell, things you feel under your feet as you walk, etc. How all of that influences how you think and behave. And because life is rarely so straightforward as just thinking about one sort of thing, people like me also factor in issues like personality, culture, all sorts of different things to determine how people will experience a space and the repercussions of people being in a space or interacting with an object. I have my own consulting practice, and I edit a subscription newsletter called Research Design Connections, which takes neuroscience findings that are valuable to designers and sort of translates those findings from science-ese, if you will, into everyday language so people can use the material in practice. And I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Great, thank you. Next, Carol Stolt.
Hi, I'm Carol Stolt with FGM Architects. I'm a design principal and an interior designer in the higher ed practice. I raised a severely ADHD kid and an ADD kid, and after kind of trying to navigate all of the issues that those kids faced as they were growing up, it became a passion of mine to pay more attention to what the designed environment can do to accommodate people with neurodiverse issues. So that's kind of been a passion of mine for a while.
Thanks, Carol. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Olivia, and then Olivia is going to share some information on neurodiversity, some statistics and definitions, just to lay some groundwork before we jump into a discussion. So go ahead, Olivia.
Yeah, absolutely. First off, Olivia Danielson-Veed. I'm a senior project interior designer and associate at HOK, focusing on commercial environments from workplace to S&T and justice even, with always focusing on a lens of neurodiversity, how to incorporate that into all of our vertical markets. That's been a really big push for HOK, and also creating equity within the built environment. So I'm going to share my screen here. All right, can everyone see that okay?
Yes.
All right, great. So we're going to just go over, like Corey mentioned, go over a few kind of definitions, considerations, kind of to set us up for the panel discussion. So, just wanting to acknowledge not all impairments or disabilities look the same. Some are visible, some are not, some are permanent, situational or temporary. So keeping that in mind. And interestingly enough, about 70% of disabilities are invisible. So not seeing someone in a wheelchair, on crutches, that sort of thing. So, you know, understanding that we're really designing for folks that we're not seeing their initial neurodiversities, but wanting to be more inclusive with that. So understanding that, you know, everyone's brain works differently. So inherently, all of us are neurodiverse at some capacity. But some of the neurodivergent disorders that we kind of focus on, or that you hear a lot about, are autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, dyslexia is a big one for our conversation today. And there's a list of other ones as well that we kind of, you know, talk about. About 1 in 5 people are considered neurodivergent, but fewer than 50% know it. That statistic always just really kind of gets me, because there's so much that hasn't been studied previously that, you know, in our experience with higher ed or even younger, that we just didn't know, that we weren't in, you know, interacting with the space in a way that was, you know, typical. So this is an example of some other neurodivergent individuals who are who identify as neurodivergent and are well known. Put that at minimum there. So the World Health Organization updated their definition of, you know, how disabilities interact and condition in the space. So physical, cognitive, and social exclusion can occur at the point of interaction between an individual and the environments where there's a misalignment. So really that's talking about their built environment. You know, that's one way to look at that, and understanding that we just have so much influence on that. You know, as designers, we are trying to constantly understand the human experience, and you know, having this lens and understanding that impact that is, you know, integrated into either, you know, an interior fit out to something that's larger, you know, it could be a renovation or something that's ground up, you know, that's going to really be around for quite a few years and some decades. So we want to make sure that we're thinking about this and doing the right thing for our, for the individuals using the space. So there's a quote, we had done a study, and one of the quotes from an autistic child really kind of hit home, and it says, "We are freshwater fish in saltwater. Put us in freshwater, we function just fine. Put us in saltwater, we struggle to survive." So really, that's again harkening back to that built environment, and you know, taking into consideration these neurodiverse principles can really help someone survive and, you know, change their entire world. Also taking a look at sensory thresholds. So you'll hear these terms throughout today too, you know, neurotypical, which is something that's kind of right in the middle. Again, acknowledging that not everyone is neurotypical on every sensory input, but you also have people that scale to hypersensitivity on one end of the scale, which is an individual that needs less stimuli, sensory stimuli, to understand and interact with their space. That looks like, you know, organic, simple patterns, taking a look at what colors you're using, like not using really saturated colors, toning down the tactile visual distractions, having more clean, orderly space, you know, little to no background noise, and really being responding well to personal boundaries. Whereas someone on the very other end of the spectrum, considered hyposensitive, would need more sensory stimuli to be able to understand and interact in the space around them. So layering in textures and planes, really playing with the colors, contrasting and saturation, giving plenty of interest, needing some background noise or music, and a big one, especially in the schools, place to move and fidget. I think we can all think back to when we were younger and having to sit in a desk for, you know, the whole day, a whole class period, what have you, in a really hard, rigid, uncomfortable chair and posture, and having to be able to, you know, learn and perform at our best. It just, now as we understand more, it just seems almost crazy to think that we expect that of everyone. And then also taking a look at the senses. We have learned the 5 senses when we were younger, but there are actually 8 that we speak to and identify. So you have the typical ones that you learned about previously, auditory, visual, tactile, olfactory, gestation. And then adding on to those being proprioceptive, so how your body feels internally with different sensations, proprioceptive, which is body positioning, within open areas and closed areas, semi-enclosed, how you perceive the space between you and someone next to you, and then vestibular, which is balance and coordination. Something that Corey and I were talking about earlier is just, we had the pandemic, everyone went home and was learning from home, working from home. You got really desensitized to a lot of these sensory inputs. And then coming through the pandemic, having to go back in the classroom, back in the workforce, in the classroom, whether you were faculty or a student, and have to be shoehorned into an environment that really wasn't working before the pandemic. So it just kind of was a catalyst for a lot of angst and misalignments. So talking about that survey, most surveys focus on children and male respondents. So we wanted to make sure that we were working with a group that, got the female and non-binary perspective in there as well. So the majority of people in this study were women or non-binary. We also focused on a slightly older age group, 30 to 60, that more being kind of the faculty age range, because most studies do not focus on that age range either. So you're seeing here, the majority of people were hypersensitive and followed by the hyposensitive. And then you're also seeing a breakdown of ADHD versus autism and dyslexia. And then also understanding that over half of the people have a combination of neurodiversities. So someone might be super sensitive to sound and that auditory stimuli, but need more of the tactile its stimuli input in their environment, being able to move around. So these things aren't, you're not one or the other necessarily. You can be more than one things. These aren't mutually exclusive. And then I kind of want to bring out 2 main points from the study as well. We talked about what sensory inputs people who are hypersensitive are most highly sensitive to, and that was auditory input followed by visual. On the flip side of that, we also took a look at what someone who identifies as hyposensitive and what they need more of in their environment. And again, it was auditory and visual. So as designers, that's difficult, right? We have to find that balance between, someone who needs less of the auditory and more of it. And what does that look like? Really taking a look at zoning and such, and then also taking a look at the visual distractions and how that interacts in the space. So our job isn't easy, but we don't do this for it to be easy. I know we all like to kind of dig into these problems, and is why you all are here today. So just kind of to close on this educational portion, we like to say when you design for the extreme, you benefit the mean. So thinking of that sensory threshold scale, if you design for both hyper and hyposensitive environments and individuals, then you also benefit people who identify as being neurotypical. And Corey, I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thanks, Olivia. That was helpful context.
Absolutely.
So we're going to have a discussion here centered around a few prompts that we've assembled in advance. But I want to call everyone's attention before we get started to the bottom of the Zoom window where there's the Q&A button. The chat, I believe, has been disabled. So if you want to ask a question, go ahead and put it into the Q&A, and we'll be monitoring that throughout the discussion. And we'll make sure we save a fair amount of time at the end so that we can start going through some of those and hear the panelists respond to those questions as well. So really to get started, I thought we might as well just jump in with kind of the biggest question of all, which is what are some of the biggest challenges when you're designing an educational space for a diverse population like we're talking about? And what are some of the things that work and what are some of the things that just don't work? And I thought, Dr. Augustine, if we could start with some of your thoughts, that would be great.
Sure. I think when you're designing for people who are neurodiverse or potentially neurodiverse, important a couple major concepts in mind. For example, what can be done in a space used by a single individual who's neurodiverse for example, in their home is much different than what can reasonably be accomplished for a collection of neurodiverse people who are sharing a space. I think it's also important to remember that the older people get, people who have moved through the education system, for example, for example, people who've made it into the workforce, by the time people are in the workforce, certainly they've learned how in their individual situation they need to accommodate whatever issues that they face. And I think it's also important to key in on the fact that neuroscientists, people like me, have about how to effectively design workplaces and schools. For example, what sorts of colors support certain sorts of thinking, etc. And when those rules, that information in general is applied, you find a space that works for people who are neurodiverse and also for people who are not neurodiverse. So, I mean, I think when we see that long list of all the various possible neurodiversities that exist, like dyspraxia and all that, it can start to seem overwhelming. But when we learn that, the tenets of good, school design, good workplace design work for everyone, things become a lot more reasonable to accomplish. Also, I want to conclude with the fact that certainly by the time people get to a workplace, and also by the time they're older, for example, in universities, certainly, there's a certain sort of environment that, if provided, gives people with a range of diversity an opportunity to sort of get their head back in the right state for whatever they're up to. So, we have to remember that in general, good schools, good workplaces today are arranged with are designed with a range of sorts of spaces for individuals. But to this sort of like get your head back in the right space, if you will, would share certain features wherever it is. For example, it would be a space with truly good acoustic and visual shielding, because people who are neurodiverse in different ways, when they sort of get off a productive track, if you will, have to do a range of different things to get back onto it. So, you need to give them visual and acoustic shielding so that they can feel comfortable doing that. You need to make sure these spaces with this great visual and acoustic shielding are available to all, so that there's no stigma in use. Who would know whether someone was using one because they have ADHD and they just feel too sort of on, or if they're entering one because they have a report that's due in an hour that they better get done. And so important these not be in the reservation system, so that they are generally available. And there's some rules of thumb for about how many you would need in any particular workplace. So you need, depending on the size of the floor plate, maybe one or a couple on every floor. You want to locate them in basically the same place on any floor, so someone who would need one wouldn't have to search for one, etc. But I just want to make the point that my final point would be to iterate that all of this information about hypo this and hyper that and all the different combinations can seem overwhelming, but when you get right down to it, there's a really straightforward way to create spaces that do support individuals.
Great. Carol or Olivia, anything that you'd like to add to that?
I'll jump in. There are certain things about designing spaces that are going to be fixed. Like, you are going to select a color for a space, and hopefully that color will speak to a broad range of people, but we like to provide flexibility wherever we can. So things that can be flexible or have some flexibility built into them would be the ability to control lighting, to dial it up or dial it down, the ability to control your temperature so that you can be comfortable within your own space. And then the ability to have some flexibility in the types of furniture that are provided in spaces so that you can choose the way you want to experience that space. So I think,
and that all relates to like what I was mentioning before about, creating a range of spaces in any workplace today, things like that.
Right. So if you can give people the ability to control bits of their environment, they're going to be more comfortable and feel more included and welcome in those environments.
Absolutely. And just to kind of reiterate, in the workplace, so this would be on the faculty side as well, wanting to make sure that the faculty have, a choice of work settings, whether someone feels more comfortable in a lounge position versus maybe a standing position, or they need to move, throughout the day. So really providing those activity workplace or work-based settings is important, even in this level. And then just really focusing on the equity, which, Carol and Sally were both saying as well. Equity of space, equity of representation, making sure that people feel like they have, control over their environment as much as possible.
Great. Well, the next thing I think we could talk about is certainly technology in the learning environments isn't new. We've had that for a while now, but I think the pandemic, as you alluded to earlier, Olivia, changed how we think about how we behave in classrooms, and technology certainly impacted that, particularly with higher education institutions moving toward some kind of hybrid classrooms. You might see less of that at lower age groups, so perhaps it's age dependent. But I was wondering if you could all comment on what experience you've had with integrating technology into the classroom, keeping this neurodiversity topic in mind.
So I can start that one off. One thing that we like to do in the lens of equity in some of these like larger lecture halls, if they're going to be doing a hybrid environment, and we do like to plan for that, just because we like to give the flexibility again to what Carol and Sally were saying, but thinking through wanting someone on the screen to be represented at the same scale as someone who is in the room, and you need about a 36-inch wide monitor to do that. So we're not expecting that there would be that many 36-inch monitors, but when you're sizing the large screen, thinking through that about how many people are you thinking of having in this lecture hall, this room, and then kind of thinking through the equity of it, experience, and making sure that the microphones are placed around the space equally, so that you can hear when you're on the screen versus in person. Those are really important things. And then the other one would be offering maybe like so having like a larger lecture hall, but then offering maybe a broadcast of that someone can be attending in a smaller group. So maybe it's, broadcasted to a smaller room. So someone can go there that doesn't feel comfortable in that proprioceptive lens, being in a room with a ton of people. They can go to an area that would have maybe a different seating setting, and then also a smaller group to be around.
Yeah, I think, Olivia, one of the things you said is really important, is having microphones placed around the room, because what really leads you to feel like you're not included is if you can't hear those nuanced conversations that are happening in the back of the room, or that are happening, somebody who's remote says something, but you can't quite pick up what they're saying. It makes everyone feel like they're not really part of the program. So microphones are really critical, and then having enough monitors around the room so that everyone in the room can see a monitor. You're not struggling to see what's up on the monitor is really important.
Great. Anything else on that topic?
I think the major points have been covered, and I would just also make the point that you would want to be supporting the people who are in that shared space, but we have learned a lot about home environments, or the places, you know, the remote locations in which people might be participating in these sessions, and it can be handy to share that information with remote participants so they think about all sorts of things that they might tweak in their home environment so that they can participate most effectively.
I think the only other thing I would add to kind of, reiterate what Carol was saying too is wanting people to be able to hear and participate in that regard. So really having a keen eye on acoustics. We're probably going to be bringing that up a lot today, but acoustics is just, that is critical. So if you don't have good acoustics in these rooms, you can have the best technology, but it's just going to fail if you don't have those other attributes in the room to support it.
Right, and I would just make the point that for a very long time, we've known that for all these neurodiversities that are mentioned and some that weren't even on the list, acoustic situations are the key to successful participation, et cetera. So, acoustics should be, a key consideration when you're thinking about designing for the neurodiverse, but simultaneously, it already should have been a key consideration when you were designing for just plain old people in general. So,
Yep, absolutely.
And that just goes back to the point that designing with all of these things in mind is really benefiting everyone. And so it's, you're not just targeting a certain set of people. Everybody benefits by doing these things.
And if you think about good principles of design in general, you find that there's a huge overlap in terms of designing for neurodiverse populations. So, it's like if I was thinking about people in general, I might say this sort of color would be best based on the research. And when I'm thinking about designing for neurodiverse population, lo and behold, I might suggest basically the same color. So, all works out about the same.
Yeah.
Great. One of the trends we've seen in education, I think, over a long period of time is moving further and further away from lecture-based learning and more into a lot of collaborative learning. So I'm wondering if we could talk about what kind of design considerations we can make that make collaboration easier. Thinking in a classroom, if you divided people into groups of 5 and 20% of the people in the world are some form of neurodiverse, there's going to be somebody in every group at least, right? So what are some of the things that we can do to make collaborative environments? And I even think of this in terms of introverts and extroverts. How can we get everyone to kind of work together?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think you have to, just like everything else, you have to realize that one size is not going to fit all, and you have to provide a little bit of variety in those kinds of settings, so that if there is that one person who's really struggling to be close to others within a group, they have a way to participate in the group without having to feel so closed in. So again, it's control over environment. It's providing variety where maybe in that situation, everybody sits in lounge chairs, so they're not so close together like you are when you're sitting around a table. But giving people that variety where if they choose that certain variety, they don't feel singled out because it's not the only choice and it's not only for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And then on that lens of, flexibility, the flexible furniture, but having it be something that's user movable, not like facilities movable. So someone can hack the space to be what they need it to be for that moment. And the next group can do the same thing for them. And these settings don't have to, they could still be, kind of creating visual interest, right? So you can have like tiered, layers there. So maybe there's, some people want to stand, some people want to sit. It's just giving that, variety that, Carol and Sally were mentioning too.
Yeah, great. So the next question, I think if we were designing new buildings, it would be with unlimited budgets, right? It would be easy to incorporate a lot of these ideas. A lot of our projects, though, that's not the reality. It's a renovation, and maybe funds are limited and we can only do so much. I'm wondering if you could all touch on, if in a limited environment like that, what are the most important things that we really need to touch on in redesigning educational spaces?
I mean, and just to go back to, what I mentioned before, what the research has been saying for a long time, you know, acoustics are really very
Mhm.
key in
Yeah.
places for those who are neurodiverse and also for the population as a whole. So, you know, I think, you know, that should be, you know, you have considerations that might be before that, just in terms of like you know, class size that's anticipated or whatever. But, you know, as soon as, you know, you move beyond those very specific practical considerations, the first thing that should come up is acoustics.
I completely agree. And the industry has really responded, I think, really well to giving us products that we could add on a day two, basis, right? So after the fact, and, really implementing those as, something for a renovation. I think, getting the client to understand that dollars spent there is just going to, be really beneficial to them. So I think that's probably that's the thing I was going to say too, Sally, would be acoustics. We're actually doing a lot of audits for our higher ed clients. Some of them have standards, right? So doing kind of an audit for them and saying, here are some abilities that you might have within your current standards. Here are some suggestions on how to maybe change your standards for when you do have a renovation, because some of this is nice to talk about early. They may not have a project right now, but to get it in their heads early so they're understanding that when they're moving forward and when they get, grants aligned to actually have these projects, because I think we've all had those where it's kind of like you start on these and then they go on hold and then we need to, re-engage. So that's something that we're doing a lot of right now, and just helping with that education component so that they're ready to roll when they have the funds available to kind of get going. And then knowing that there's obviously, like Corey said, there's a lot of options for when it's a new build. And we also are developing a checklist right now to kind of identify the priorities, right? So if you do have a renovation, or you in a multi-building campus, you want to do kind of like an audit of your whole campus, you're able to see what is working, what's not working, and then the things that you do want to implement. There's a priority to those on what would be the most beneficial. And then lastly, the thing I would want to add would be we're seeing a lot more like diversity boards, or, neurodiverse identifying students that get together and then have some sort of group, and then being able to converse with them in that audit of the standards and get their input so they feel like they have a voice in their community as well.
I think one other thing that I'd like to add, I totally agree with everything that Sally and Olivia said, but I think technology goes hand in hand with acoustics. And it helps build on top of those acoustics, because the microphones and speakers are going to just enhance the acoustics. So I think you have to get the acoustics right, but along with that, you have to get the technology right. And one other thing I'll just throw out there is, a lot of these products that have become available on the market to enhance acoustics, are not terribly costly. So you're not breaking the bank by doing these design enhancements. These are things that can be done very cost effectively, but they're so effective in the end.
And they also add, in some of these, you can add color and texture, and then that tactile moment as well in that ability. And I'm even looking at Sally's background here, I just kind of want to reach out and touch it, right? So that's exactly what we're talking about, bringing in some of those elements.
Could I ask a question here? We've been talking about technology and acoustics, a little bit of color. What is the research saying about natural materials, natural light, access to green roofs or nature, in terms of neurodiversity and design? We design schools and we drive by a year later and all the shades are pulled. We put a lot of windows and the shades are pulled, and you can't help but wonder what the experience is of the child in that classroom. Some may need that natural light, and some it may be too much, the intensity of direct light. So I'm just curious what the research or what your thoughts are on natural materials and just nature as a way to kind of help a child feel calmer or be able to focus a little bit better.
Biophilic design is always a plus, no matter what the user group is, but you do have to bear in mind that many individuals who are neurodiverse, a particular issue with glare, which can come directly from the window or be caused by, light bouncing off a surface, which is why it's great you provide a range of spaces in many modern environments. So people could do something like work on one side of a building in the morning, on the other side in the afternoon, and group all the little students around. So, you build in, things that logically would exist, whether any students were neurodiverse or not, such as windows. So, natural materials are desirable, but you always have to be very concerned about glare and something I mentioned earlier, which is shadows. In extremes, those would be issues for any individual.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree with that. I think the thing that excites me about biophilic design is I feel like it's now becoming best practice. So we don't have to like educate so much on it, talk about it so much. People expect it. They expect us to be experts on it, and we are, right? So I think that's really a benefit that people are kind of just expecting that to be implemented into the design. And I think, at least for me, I love doing that. And then that kind of leads to the material selection then as well. And, making sure that we're selecting, natural materials when and as possible, but also, saying no to vinyls, making sure that we're not selecting anything that has, any off-gassing or, low VOCs for sure to no VOCs, and just making sure that indoor air quality is really highly scrutinized because, these students are in these buildings for an extended period of time, same with the faculty, and wanting to make sure that their experience is healthy and safe. And HOK is tracking, we track all of our materials and then report them up and out at, every year. And our big push this year is saying no to vinyl. So that is definitely a challenge, of course, but, it's definitely for the best for anyone that's using those spaces.
Great. We're starting to get a few questions in the Q&A. Again, anyone who's listening in, I encourage you to ask any questions there. But in the meantime, I think we can address a couple more topics before we open that section up. One that I wanted to talk a little bit about is I wanted to talk about wayfinding. I think the way that we handle wayfinding in the US is primarily with signs, which obviously doesn't work for every population. So I was wondering if you all could share some strategies. This is maybe less important at the lower levels of education where students are kind of guided, but it's still important. And certainly on college campuses and in upper level classrooms and classroom buildings even. How have you all addressed that in your practices, or what are some good ways to approach it?
I think, it's interesting that you bring up signs with wayfinding, because I think signs basically infer words on the around those slides, around those signs. And you can have people who aren't uh who have who are challenged by signs. So, it can be really, there's an international standard of pictograms that can be, very effectively used. And, an issue I particularly see often is words that are put on signs are words that would be known by like the administration of a site, like the Dorothy Chandler Suite with an arrow or something, but members of the general public or whatever who would be in the area, in the building, wouldn't necessarily know if they're supposed to be heading towards the Dorothy Chandler Suite or whatever, or not. So there's also, uh, a reasonable emphasis now on using the words that people understand, whether they're native English speakers or not using in lingo. And when you can, using this international system of pictograms, for example, instead of saying whatever the technical name is for, an ear, nose, and throat doctor, there's a pictogram that's been developed that communicates that same information that is handy for everyone.
what we always talk about is enhancing those signs or that text on those signs with either color,
Yeah.
texture, or lighting, so that you're getting those cues in several different ways. It's
Right.
not just one way to present the information, but emphasizing that information, with a series of, you come up with a vocabulary or language that happens in the building that helps you with navigation by using color, texture, and pattern and lighting as well.
Right.
So,
And
And
building
there-
on what, oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, and there's well-established protocols for this. For example, like if you're going to use a color scheme to define different parts of a building, the research shows like 4 colors. And 4 colors that, like the blue wing, the red wing, the green wing, or
Mhm.
whatever. And, these have to be, clearly distinguished colors, like not blue and turquoise or whatever, that might be issues. People have, color blindness, and also colors that have readily understood names, like blue, even turquoise might be something that people might interpret in different ways, or the
Mhm.
color names, for the colors that, which is such a challenge, like mauve. Who knows what mauve is? Whatever. So you
Right.
don't want that to be one of your 4 colors. You want 4
Yeah.
distinct colors like that people learn the names of
Mhm.
in preschool. There you go.
Mhm.
That's it.
Yeah. And then, playing with the saturation of those colors as well,
Right.
to build on what
Well, you
Sally
always have to
said.
think
So
about color blindness and stuff. So
yes, exactly. So what I was going to say, building on what Carol was saying, because I completely agree, adding all of those elements into like the signage. What I like to do as well is think of kind of your biggest canvases being, like floor and ceiling. So what can you
Mhm.
do with that floor pattern, floor color? Understanding too that a lot of people who are neurodiverse tend to look at the ground and avoid eye contact. So that floor is really a great canvas to be able to help them move through a space and understand how to interact in the environment, changing that, based on function, helping them kind of guide through the space so they don't have to rely on signs, whether they're, pictures or words or otherwise. So that would be my only add-on to that.
And we can use a whole series of tools to help guide people in the correct direction anyway. I'm like people tend to stay on the same sort of surface that they start out on. So, if they're heading towards, like uh something or other, and they start out on like hardwood flooring, if you come to a decision point and one way is hardwood flooring and another way is a different kind of flooring, well, they'll stay on the hardwood flooring. I mean, that's just the kind of animals we are. So use all of these different tools that might be more subtle or sophisticated or whatever in order to encourage wayfinding. And I thought it was really interesting what Carol was talking about with the signs, because there's, like Carol is familiar with the whole protocol, which is too complicated to go into here about like how you use different kinds of arrows and different kinds of sequences when you have multiple signage that's required and all that. There's, established ways that we've learned that, you can sign, for example, that align with how people think, and that means they are much less likely to get lost. And it was interesting to hear a discussion of like signaling on flooring, whatever, because that's something that has been talked about now for a number of years. For as soon as people got cell phones that they started to look at all the time, you started to really have to think about things like a different flooring warning people of an approaching like downward staircase or stuff, something like that, because they could be looking down because they don't wish to look up, or they could be looking down because they're on their cell phone. But either way, and that staircase is a hazard. Obviously you have to have the staircase for so people can move. So I'm not saying eliminate the hazard. I'm saying warn people of this potential to harm themselves and inadvertently. And that's been something we've been, again, something we've been thinking about for a long time.
Great. Well, we're at about quarter till. I'd like to try to cover one more
Yeah.
topic before we jump into the Q&A. That's something that I think that unfortunately we've had to address on every educational project for the last several years, and that's safety and security. Is there anything unique that we should be thinking about in terms of safety and security?
I mean, people can feel comforted seeing security systems in place. So there might be an inherent tendency to hide everything, right? You know, like all the metal detectors or whatever, as if, well, you know, we live in a sort of better world than we actually do, you know, so, but people can, you know, people being students and faculty members and colleagues of all various sorts, can, you know, feel, you know, get positive feelings when they actually see a metal detector and things like that. That doesn't mean you can't do some things to in the space to counter presence of the visible metal detector, you know, but you know, hiding stuff isn't necessarily a good thing here.
Yeah. I guess I would just add from like a interoceptive sensory feeling of safety, being able to, you know, have some consistency in your environment. Sally was saying, you know, if you have these, you know, kind of restoration or rejuvenation, like rooms, sensory rooms, we call them sometimes, that they're in the same place on every floor. There's some, you know, things that they can expect and have that, you know, consistency of experience. That's what I would kind of say. And then also just kind of thinking of, you know, proprioceptively, how, you know, in an open space, enclosed space, or semi-enclosed space, just kind of thinking through how that would make someone feel. If you have a huge wide open space, and let's say like a student union, for example, and it's just really loud and it's vibrant, you know, what can we do to carve out some spaces to make someone feel more comfortable in that area and make them feel more secure in their space? Kind of taking that, you know, ceiling height down to a more human scale, kind of making, you know, cocoon furniture that's maybe facing out towards a window, or you know, banquettes that face the activity. You don't have anything behind you on your back, so you feel more comfortable that way, but you still feel like you're involved in the activity and still being included. So that'd be the only thing I would add.
And I think it's cool that you bring up those biophilic elements, like having a protected back and view outside, and also something else people can feel really positive about is a view of the entrance to a space. Again, biophilically, you know, because again, that, you know, is something we've been thinking about, but it also is something that benefits all.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. I'm going to jump into the Q&A then. The first question says, can there be guidelines or options for public places to include such spaces where people want to be around a big crowd, but they also want some disconnect?
So I guess I don't know if they're expecting some sort of like standard that's adopted by everyone. I don't know that that necessarily exists at this point in time. Carol, Sally, you might know
I don't
differently.
think so.
Okay. I think it's more kind of maybe rules of engagement in your own campus, right? There might be some, you know, messaging on that, whether it be in orientation or something that's on, you know, the intranet, something, you know, more internal, to help people, you know, understand how they can navigate their space. And then also, you know, taking that lens of reviewing and being strategic about the standards for that you know, educational component, whether it be for, you know, kind of taking a look at everything holistically, I would say, and just making sure that those kind of all are starting to interact together. And as monies become available, grants get approved, that you have a path forward on what your most, you know, highest priority, highest impact items would be.
And I can tell you that um, a couple of years ago now, I was talking about related issues, and somebody talked to me after my session and said that the people that government manage, like the ADA protocols, are interested in things we're talking about. But you know, I can tell you, like, I haven't monitored the exact rate at which changes are incorporated into ADA, but I can also tell you that ADA changes move really, really slowly. You know, it
Yeah.
takes years for something to go, excuse me, from a study to those guidelines. So
Mhm.
there may ultimately be something that's similar to ADA that reflects, you know, some concerns that have been mentioned today, but
You know,
I don't think
the
it's happened yet.
well,
It'll be a while.
yeah. So the HOK has been talking actually with the Well Building Institute as
Right.
well, to maybe get some of the, neurodiverse principles into that standard.
Right.
Because to the you know, person who asked the question, it's a very good point. It's very valid that, just like we'll say LEAD started with some ideas, then it started to organize around a standard, right? And then it gets started to get pushed out into legislation and building, codes and whatnot. I definitely see this as kind of taking that same trajectory. I'm hoping it's not going to take quite as long. I think things just with technology and everything move faster. But I think that is something that's, very good to bring up as something that we could try as an industry to push, because I do think it makes a lot of sense and it would be beneficial to everyone.
Great. The next question is about olfactory issues, sensitivities to perfumes or other strong smells. That's something that we didn't really talk about. And could you all address that for a moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a number of different factors in play here. First of all, I mean, no matter whether you're neurodiverse or not, sometimes scents are really truly are so strong that they're sickening or upsetting or whatever. So those would be to be avoided in any case. Then you have additional factors to consider, like also humans don't like to feel manipulated. So scenting that seems like it's trying to calm people down or whatever, there would be reactants against that simply, because people don't like to be controlled. And then again, there are also best practices for scenting an area because, scents can be used to help people think more effectively, etc. But, they need to be used in a very operated, curated way. Like, people should never walk into a space and say, lemon or whatever. Even though lemon would be great for cognitive performance or whatever, it should never be that dramatic. And another thing to keep in mind is in today's world, a lot of any scenting that's going to take place in a building of any scale is going to come through the HVAC system, and it's going to use artificially generated scents. So obviously people can be sensitive to anything that exists on the planet, but if people are sensitive to lemon when they're in the in the same place as a lemon like that comes off the tree, if they in a space that like a school classroom that smells like lemon, the school classroom that smells like lemon almost definitely has no particles of any sort in common the kind that came off the tree. It's a totally artificially generated smell. Like I said, anybody can be sensitive to anything. You could be sensitive to the artificial elements, but it gets to the point where probably if you're sensitive to some of these elements, unfortunately, your life is pretty restricted anyway. You're having to spend a lot of your time at home or outside, whatever. So I think olfaction can be really handy in terms of helping people achieve their various objectives, but it really has to be done right and truly very subtly, or it just all blows up on you. Yeah.
I think that's such an interesting perspective on all of that. So I was even learning on that as well. But I think the other thing, just as far as smell like mitigation, for example, just like that's going to be really taking a look at that HVAC component, making sure you're getting a lot of air changeover, bringing
Right.
in natural air from outside, that sort of thing.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that's really great, but in certain situations, you really can relish the addition of a scent. For example,
100%. Yeah.
lavender
Yeah.
really does
Yeah.
help people
Mm-hmm.
relax. So maybe, well, harkening back to when I was like in elementary school, like the assistant principal's office was always where all the little misbehaviors got taken at any particular moment, whatever. So making that space smell like lavender, for example, very subtly could be very handy. And when I'm talking about the effects of scent, I'm talking about things that have come out of findings that have come out of, like well-controlled, rigorously conducted, scientific studies, which regularly do align with aromatherapy traditions, but really
Mhm.
are completely separately and
I think it's really interesting, Sally, that you're taking that perspective on olfactory issues, because I think what I normally jump to when somebody asks that kind of question is we need to isolate the copiers in rooms with doors and
Oh,
get
yeah.
the mechanical systems to be,
Right.
eliminating those odors
Right.
and printers and making sure that the cleaners that they're using are such that they're not, lingering and bothering people. So it's really interesting to hear your perspective on it, and remember that there's a flip side to this.
Oh,
And
yeah,
like
no, and that's,
all of those sensory rooms can and should have aromatherapy as a part
Mm-hmm.
of what
Yeah.
they offer. So
and you're exactly right about doing things like shielding the printers and all that for VOCs that they might release, and to me, that's like a core fundamental health issue. So it's
Mhm.
almost like at a different level of,
Mhm.
of discussion, but it really, really has to happen,
Right.
very important.
Well, we only have a couple of minutes left. So there are three more questions in the chat. I don't think that we're going to get to all of them. The ones that came in later, we probably won't reach, but there's one about lighting. And Carol, I thought I know you've done a lot of research into this. Maybe you could talk about this real quickly. And it's about circadian rhythm light systems being beneficial in school. Would cool light to warm dim be an added value? And because color changes with the light, do you already incorporate high-level lighting design into your overall design?
We do incorporate high level lighting design, and we've learned that there's a difference between circadian rhythm controls and color corrective controls. So if you want the health benefits, the full health benefits, you need to be looking at circadian rhythm controls. If you just want some psychological benefits, you can look at color change. So you have to weigh the goals and objectives of the client and the participants with the budget that they have, and try to design the most robust lighting system that the budget can bear. But it's really I work in higher ed a lot, so I'm not thinking as much about pre-K 12, but I'm thinking about all those students that take night classes that are getting blasted with light, or in the old days they get blasted with fluorescent light, and they would go home all jacked up because they just sat under these fluorescent lights for 4 hours. And we just want to make sure that that's not happening, that if they're taking a night class, the lighting level is appropriate for the time of day, and that they can go home and get some good rest so they can come back and learn again the next day.
Right.
Great. Well, that's probably the last question that we're going to have time for today. I just wanted to end by thanking our three panelists. I really appreciated hearing all the insights. Thanks again to our sponsors and to AIA Chicago. Hopefully this was enjoyable and informative for everyone. And with
Thank
that,
you for inviting us.
yeah,
Yeah,
I think
thank you for having us.
glad you were all
Thank
able to
you.
come.
Thank you.
Yep,
Bye.
thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
That went well.